Because no doubt there's a lot to talk about, and it's just on the hour, perhaps I'll run through the antitrust policy notice and get that out of the way. So this is a meeting of the OpenChain AI study group. We're having a new monthly workshop format, and this allows a 2-hour period for the AI study group to discuss matters. The primary focus is around AI compliance of various sorts, whatever type of compliance people feel is important. Now, this study group has been meeting for approximately 3 months, and the conversation has narrowed considerably from the very beginning when the question was, what is AI compliance? What are the kind of sweeping topics? That's been narrowed down over the past meetings, of which you can find the recordings on the OpenChain website. The co-chairs of this study group are David Marr from Qualcomm and Matthew Crawford from ARM. I'm currently in the ARM offices here in the United Kingdom, along with, as you can see from the video, a bunch of the ARM team. But I'm not here to run the meeting. That's Matthew and Dave's job. I'm here to show everyone's favorite slide, the antitrust policy notice. You can find the full antitrust policy on the Linux Foundation website. We show this before every meeting, and the goal is to make sure everyone knows the ground rules and is comfortable with our collaboration. If you're from an LF member company, you can ask questions of our counsel, Andy Updegrove. Now, I believe that Dave and Matthew went through an awful lot in the last workshop, discussing quite a few topics and narrowing down some of the key things to a list of around 20 items. And I believe that in this meeting, the goal will be to discuss those further and to discuss next steps. So with that, I'll hand over to Matthew and Dave for the rest of the meeting.
Thanks, Shane. Thank you everyone for joining again. As Shane just mentioned, we had those bullet points at the end of the last meeting. The agenda item that I was going to propose today is that we go through them. We've kind of fleshed out a little bit more from what we discussed last time. We can go through each of the individual points and see if we want to add or remove or just raise any concerns. Dave, is there anything you want to add to the agenda today?
Hey guys, can you guys hear me okay? I don't have a very good connection right now.
We can, yes.
It's perfect.
Oh, okay, very good. Awesome. So both Brian and Jeff, who led the substantive portions of the AI and data set discussions respectively, they've prepared a couple discussion questions in context of the last conversation that we had. I would say that without any further ado, maybe we just pass it over to Brian and Jeff. Is that all right?
That's fine. I like that idea. Yep.
All right, cool. All right, thanks. Yeah, Brian, do you want to go ahead and start the screen share?
Yeah, let me see if I can pull that up here. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks.
All right, let me know once you can see.
Can.
Wonderful. So I can play with the settings here, make it a little bigger. All right. So good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone around the globe. Yeah, so this is a follow-up to last month's meeting. I think we're going to dive into a few more details. I'm going to talk about models. Jeff will talk about data sets. And I'd really like this to be an open dialogue. So please interrupt me throughout the topics I'm raising here with questions, commentary. I'll do my best to take notes, but if anyone else can take notes, that'd be wonderful as well. And I really want to touch on 3 key topics in a bit more detail than we've done in the past. Some of them are topics we have discussed before, or some might be new. The first being model cards. Really, I think we need to come together as a group and decide to what extent model cards make sense for OpenChain, for AI models, and what is the proper format? What's the proper content? Are there resources out there today that we can leverage to come up with what we think is maybe a minimum set or an ideal set of information? The second topic is to revisit this notion of proprietary models and open source models, and to talk about whether that is a critical distinction that need to be treated differently, or if this is something that we can acknowledge, but that fundamentally the way that OpenChain can support models through the supply chain is license agnostic in the proprietary versus open source world. And then finally, I'd like to raise the topic about to the extent there's a gap in the model card between what a provider is willing or desiring to share and what a recipient is looking for, can that gap be filled through process or internal governance policies? So I know we've talked about model cards before, but just as some background, I've pasted a link here. This was from maybe 5 years ago. Don't quote me that. Maybe longer. Maybe 10 years. There was a paper published presenting this idea of model cards, and since then, we've seen lots of companies and sites and essentially the industry embracing model cards at varying degrees. And something we talked about in the past is that there's while there's a common understanding of what a model card is, there's definitely not commonality in what they contain and how they're shared. And so recipients, expectations and ability to ingest them really varies depending on where they're getting it from, who they're getting it from. And I think that's something that OpenChain can help fix. So the first topic I want to talk about here, and I'd love to get some opinions, is what is the best format for sharing this information? And I think we can make the assumption that model cards to some extent make sense for us. If anyone objects, that I'd love to hear that. I think that model cards are wholly for helping the industry. But assuming that we do want to have model cards, do folks have thoughts on what is the best format? To me, having a consistent format is probably the most important thing. That way you can set up automation and can really get that muscle memory, so that you know what you're looking for. And then maybe there's some, maybe after the format is consistent, maybe there's a bit of a delta on the content. And I know, for example, SPDX has a nice consistent format. And it is as simple as that. We want to point to SPDX as a format for model cards, and kind of throw that to the group.
Brian, what is your thoughts on being that sort of higher level, say, rather than define the best format, we say you choose the best format for your use case or your need or your business, rather than there is a best format? It's a question to the group, really. It's not one or the other is better or worse. Andrew, you came off mute. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, Matthew, I completely agree with that. My concern is that obviously SPDX is mentioned as one possible format between in the ISO 5230 specification for an SBOM, and similarly as far as AI is concerned, what I'm concerned about is that we try to get too prescriptive. I don't disagree with a single word that Brian said, and it's absolutely important that we use a format that works. But I think for us to try to define what that format is within this forum and within OpenChain is not appropriate. So Matthew, I think your approach of saying that that we need to have considered and used an appropriate format for the use case is a sensible one, not least because these formats are bound to change fairly rapidly at the moment, because ultimately they're not actually completely driven by the use case. They're also driven by the ever-emerging legislation and regulation in this area, and we know that some jurisdictions are well ahead of the others. It's important that people who are selecting a format go through a process and think about what is the most appropriate format for the use case, and obviously that format needs to be publicly available. properly documented, etc., etc. But to be too prescriptive, I think, is something that we need to be a little bit careful about, and we try to avoid doing that.
Jimmy, you have a point? Raise your hand.
Yes, now that I'm off mute. So I would advocate towards putting the requirement rather as having a consistent, public, and documented model chosen for the company, and then processes for policies to translate between the preeminent or the most common models, so that you have at least a process or an understanding. How will I translate this model card, say the Hugging Face versus the SPDX? How will I translate that so that you have a policy and have documentation for that? I think that's might be a good level for OpenChain to come in at and say you should have selected a model or several model cards or models for model cards, and then be able to translate between them, and preferably the models you should have selected should be, you know, public and documented, so that other people have a chance of at least providing you the right information.
Thanks for that, Jimmy. Any further points on format?
So I'm hearing loud and clear about we don't want to be too prescriptive. We don't want to put people in a box that isn't going to scale with the ever growing list of changes. But I do want to again point out that one of the issues that I'm seeing today is that the information, while it might be there, it's in a different order, it's in a different file format, it's either native to the model, or it's an addendum, or it's on an HTML website, and as a recipient it becomes a bit of a manual search to find the information you need. And I think to the extent we can provide some predictability as to where to find something, what it should look like, that way if you see a gap, you know immediately, okay, this information is not being provided to me, I can manage this, as opposed to just continually peeling back the layers trying to find it in a futile effort.
It could be that, between two entities, if we are wanting to share a format, we could agree it at that level. But I think OpenChain saying you should choose the best format for the use case, e.g. SPDX and other formats, might be the line that we're comfortable with setting. I noticed two people have a hand up. Yari?
Yes, I'm unmuted. Yes. So yeah, kind of second that, because if thinking that what do we have today in the OpenChain specification, it doesn't say anything about the SPOM format. It just says one needs to be able to produce SPOM. So I don't know if we need to go into the details to saying that, okay, the whatever model card needs to be this or that, just discussed earlier, that if kind of going one step back and seeing that what's in the current OpenChain specifications, that how much details do we want to have in AI study here.
Thanks for that. Jimmy?
Yes, I very much support and share your pain, Brian, on having to do these things manually and translating between them. But I think sort of for OpenChain, I would try to address that by publishing guides or recommendations on current best practices in addition to whatever specification we come out with. And that will in itself be rather strong, but it will not place us in a position that sort of all the other hard work we do on whatever specification comes out of this becomes outdated as soon as or by us making the wrong market choice on models. So we sort of make ourselves a little bit agnostic to models, but we can certainly say that we see these as sort of the best models currently because they meet X, Y, and C criteria that are objective and could be met by many models, but these at least do meet that. That's it from
Yeah, these are great points. These all makes a lot of sense. I think we do maybe maybe that is the answer. We find something in the middle that provides some proposed structure or predictability, but leaving the door wide open for adaptation and change.
Dave, you've got your hand up.
Yeah. Hey, so following on Jimmy's comment there, so the kinds of things that made SPDX successful are so to me are first machine readability, things that don't require a special kind of a language model to have to parse out. So predicted fields, understanding what is the syntax for defining a field, and what ideally I think to me field names, and then some expected length for the value for that field, like how many characters were numbers, or actually characters or numbers, what goes into that field. So those are kinds of things that to me allow for automation and processing, because when we're working with the folks that have to actually do the plumbing in the backend systems, those are the questions that they're going to need to be able to answer. And if once the plumbing's in place, it's hard to redo it, because then all the other things in the chain of production will be expecting certain things, and those interfaces won't work. And so redoing all that is, I think, costly. But I appreciate the point that picking a winner is difficult. So if we go down the path of what are the essential characteristics, I think that might be productive. I'm not experiencing issues with LFX right now.
Okay, good to know. I just couldn't log on using that, so.
Okay. I had issues before, but not this morning.
Oh, maybe it's Europe's turn to experience issues.
Yeah.
Sorry, didn't mean to derail the conversation.
No, I made my point.
Brian, do you want to carry on?
Yeah, so put a pin in the format. The next discussion topic is, so I can't remember who it was. I'm very happy you raised the notion of SBOMs. So the way I'm thinking about model cards is sort of this: where does it sit between, if you're using open source as an analogy, between a notice.txt file, which is really the bare minimum in my opinion, on one side, and a fully fledged SBOM on the other side, which contains, security vulnerabilities, version history, dependencies, the whole 9 yards. Similarly, I think with model cards, is there a way we can come up with a set of bare minimum criteria that we appreciate that certain players in the industry may not want to disclose X, Y, or Z, but at a minimum, you have to disclose A, B, and C. And then maybe provide as a complement to it, here is a very robust model card that would be ideal if you're comfortable. So I'm going to walk through a couple slides here that I pulled off of Hugging Face. SPDX points to Hugging Face. Hugging Face, in my experience, is sort of the de facto standard of the industry as of right now. I know it's always changing. I'll probably change my mind in a few weeks, but as of right now, I think it's at least an interesting place for us to have a discussion point about the types of information that a Hugging Face suggests for the model card. And I'd like to run through those and just kind of poll this group as far as, for each data point, is this something we see as critical, as a nice to have, or as irrelevant? And then, of course, are we missing anything? So the first section talks about model description. So this is a free text field, and you talk about the model. So you could say that this is a large language model for processing text to speech, for example, and then it could go into some of the background. to me, this one is it's interesting. It's a nice way to sort of get comfortable with what the model does. But I don't know how critical it is, since it is a bit amorphous. That being said, it is amorphous, so it would be difficult for someone to object to having to provide a description because, again, it's a free text field. Any thoughts?
Just a quick thought that indeed it does look like something that just makes sense. When it comes to the optional components, do you think that those which are not optional, which are mandatory, are absolutely required in all cases? And this is just a question based on the fact that every time we make something required, we put a barrier to entry. This isn't to suggest that these should not be mandatory, but just asking the question from your optic.
Yeah, it's a great question. Just for clarity, the categories, as well as whether it's optional or not optional, this is all straight from Hugging Face. So this isn't even a recommendation to OpenChain. I think, to be fair, I think as a group we could say everything is optional. I think that would be reasonable. I think hopefully we can find a couple of anchor points. But even though Hugging Face has these as mandatory and then as others as optional, in my experience in going through many models, you will find some that have a complete lack of anything, and they maybe have one of a dozen items filled out. So even though something's mandatory, it really isn't mandatory. It seems like it's more like highly suggested, I would say.
Yeah.
So what was your question to the group, Brian, about this page? Can we think of additional ones or any?
Yeah, so I've got 4 or 5 slides going through. So what's on Hugging Face? I was going to go through one by one. I think that might, now that we're meeting as a group, that might be a little bit laborious. So maybe we'll go through page by page. But the thought is to get some commentary on these data points that Hugging Face suggests for a model card. Which of these do we think are nice to haves? Which do we think are very critical and something that we can actually expect or demand of a provider to include? And I think that is a bit of a loaded statement, because we do want to be very sensitive to requiring folks to do things, because that can scare people away. And then which of these are just completely irrelevant that we should just take off the table altogether. And then finally at the end, what's missing? Hugging Face is an example. There are other model card examples out in the world. We could start from scratch. This is just to sort of get the discussion going. So this first page has things like the description, who created it, what this model does, what type of model is it? Is it a language? Is it a text model? Is it an image model? What the license is. I think that one is of interest to this group. And then finally here is, this is model 2.1 called Cat Chat, for example, and it's fine-tuned from Rat Chat, let's say. So that way that there is some progeny here.
For me, when I look at the kind of second, third, fourth points, I guess there's also things like trained by and tested by and distributed by, deployed by as well. So it's probably, I don't know if they're on other pages as well, but I'm sure there are other useful anecdotes that we can probably try and capture.
Yeah. And if it makes more sense, I could just go through all of them, and then we could have a high level conversation as opposed to more of a working session. Let's do that. So continuing down through Hugging Face's recommendations, they talk about the uses of a model, both what the direct uses and what maybe the downstream supply chain uses would be, what is out of scope for its use cases, and then warnings about bias in the model or the data sets, the risks associated with it, and limitations. So this could come down to performance, or they can say this has only been trained on English, so other languages are going to have a hard time. Or maybe they say this produces a hallucination or error rate at 10%, which maybe is fine for entertainment purposes, but would not be appropriate to use for managing some infrastructure, let's say. And then recommendations on from the deployer's perspective, these are the things you can do to mitigate the risks, and here's our recommendation on how to use this model. Additional materials are some of the training details, the training data sets, how they trained, whether it was pre-processing or not, and whether it was supervised or unsupervised. Lots of information on how this thing was trained, and then finally, what kinds of performance are we seeing? So the first one was about training and performance, and this is now about post training. How did they test this thing to make sure that it's behaving as well as they expected, or excuse me, or at least justifies their use cases. So this is about how it was tested, what the results were like, what factors did they consider, and the key summaries and takeaways. And then finally, I think this is the last one. So finally, the last suggestion by Hugging Face is to talk about some of the environmental impacts. So you discuss, the hardware, potentially carbon emissions, and where it's occurring. I do want to flag this one as something that is highly unlikely to be required. A, because it's difficult to quantify, and B, because they're, at least out here in California, there's legislation that's very tight around making claims around environmental impacts. So I think that would be one that's definitely in the suggested bucket. So I know I went through a lot here. If people want to chime in on any of these data points that they think are, again, very important, potentially mandatory, which ones they think are very important and interesting, which ones they think are kind of a throwaway, we don't even need to consider. And finally, what kind of gaps do we have? What's missing here that we that we can bring to the table and produce as a new data point.
Thank you, Brian. I think one, this is Prasad. So I think I've had a experience earlier, like going through this data. I mean, these attributes. I would say on the training data set, do we have like a parameter covering training data license? So essentially the license, if any, that is, under which the training data is distributed, because that's one thing that when you, some of the models, when you train that with data, sometimes the models tend to miss that information in their output. And that could pose, even though I like the fact that you have a parameter talking about what this model is trained using, which is a good thing, that that at least kind of helps you with the model genealogy to a certain extent. But the training data license could be, in my opinion, that could be some parameter to specify that. Potentially that will give us an idea if there is any license associated with that training data, other than the actual license of the model itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think you're raising sort of the $64,000 question right now. Jeff will probably go into this in the data set side, but what I'm seeing is in the industry is that model recipients are starving for that information because they're seeing lawsuits and they want to understand what is in this thing, but license terms apply. And on the flip side, we're seeing providers, 6 months or a year ago, they at least appeared to be more open to providing that information, and now are being a bit more close to the chest, and maybe don't want to disclose it because, again, the lawsuits and sort of the way the industry is moving. So I don't have a good answer, but I do agree that is a critical discussion point. So I'd love to hear some other folks chime in on that.
Yeah.
If I may, that is our main problem. It's how to be compliant, how to responsibly source training data, fulfilling the law, fulfilling licenses. But I find myself that in most cases, the available training data is very insufficiently listed. There is no license. If there is a license, maybe there is a license to the database, but not the content of the database. What happens with scrapped material from the net, and where was it collected, and etc. So Yes, I agree. I don't have an answer, but it's very difficult to be compliant in the, or at least there is no clear guidance on how to be compliant in this, in the jungle of data. That's personally what I'm facing.
Totally
Yeah.
agree. Our biggest problem.
Yeah, especially if you're let's say some of the models that we use, like assistant models in my organization, what is happening is, I think in their case they are clearly specifying their parent model, but the parent model by themselves, perhaps they are using some of the the training data set, which is could be potentially, again, depending on the kind of licenses that was associated with those training data set. The fear is that, yes, some of the output that are coming out of these models obviously could have that effect of that copyleft license that is derivatory in nature, and it could be potentially applied to the output that comes out of that model as well. So that is something that we need to be definitely concerned about, and we have to at least have some way of explaining what license that is associated with the trading data, and if we can maybe have a parameter to control that, just like you have a license for model, maybe license for training data could be an attribute, and again, it could be an optional attribute, is something that we may want to think about at least specifying or supporting to specify.
Hey, this is Jeff. I think an interesting question is, what's the relationship between the model card and the data card? Because in theory, this visibility you want when you're looking at a model card is included in the data card. And in effect, are we going to reproduce the entire data card in the model card? So talking about like a data set license on its face may not mean much, as we talked about in the last meeting. It could have an Apache license to it, but that doesn't include rights to the data itself. And then you've got cascading sub data sets. So when we talk about something like, what's the training data set or the training data, is that a link or a reference to like the actual data set card? I mean, we could limit it to something like training data set high level license, right? And there's some information there, but from experience, if anybody's dug into that, that's kind of like the first step in the analysis. So wondering if model cards and dataset cards are companions in the process, so you don't need to reproduce everything in a model card.
Yeah.
Put your hand up. Stephen, you're still on mute if you're trying to talk.
Oh yeah, hi there. Thanks for that. I just wanted to point out that paper that's is in the chat. It's a really interesting paper which doesn't attempt, it very positively defines the definition of what it means to be open and also what it means to be complete in terms of sharing information. And they make a good distinction between the two aspects. And they also look quite hard at what it means to be a producer and a consumer of models. And this model openness framework that's coming out of the Linux Foundation is really interesting. And so it's a bit of a meta conversation, I think, for OpenChain. But is it our intention to define openness, or is it our intention to define what complying with the degree of openness and completeness that a model producer has chosen to move towards? So there's a degree of like a meta kind of conversation, I think, to be had as to what the purpose is. For me, obviously, step one is if someone intends to be partially open and partially complete with what they share, but if you're consuming that model, then if you're going to be compliant with good practice, you have to be able to work with that as much as someone who's sharing a fully open model, in the same way that there is that mix at the moment with open source software. So there's some really useful work there, and I think it is complementary.
Ibrahim has presented to OpenChain recently on this paper. Has this paper been shared around, Shane?
I don't know if it's been shared onto this particular list. The meeting has been shared with the general list and specification lists. But I can resend to this list more information, and I'll do so after this call.
And on the topic of what we're hoping to achieve, I think we tried to cover that in the first few sort of meetings. It's trying to build that trust in the ecosystem with AI. And we didn't want to touch on whether that was a model or a data set. I know we put a pin in the open source versus proprietary point, but it's kind of building that trust. How do we build trust? And I think to the point that what's on the slide, if we're sharing this information, or we have processes to think about whether we're going to share this information, that to me is a good step, like we've done with the other standards within the OpenChain portfolio. Prasad, I think you were about to talk when I opened it up to Stephen. Did you want to add any points?
Yeah, I just had another one more just a point to make is the first set of parameters that I kind of looked at, like when the shared was the model type. That was pretty nice to kind of hear that it's primarily talks about the model being like, hey, is it an LLM? Is it a visual, whatever it could be, right? My question is that does this also potentially cover, or maybe we need to have maybe a separate attribute to or sub attribute to cover, let's say, is it a multimodal model or not? Do we need to have ability to say that, because some models could be multimodal? So how do we, or is there a separate parameter that says whether it is multimodal or not? And in that case, if it is multimodal, then obviously some of the corresponding training data sets attributes also have to be accordingly, obviously expand, because you'll have different training data for the various modes. So I'm kind of wondering, like, how is that being handled here in this is it model type comprises that ability, or is it like we need to introduce maybe sub attributes?
I think you've hit on a gap here that's missing, because you're right. If it's multi-model, you can either have a superset of a card that lists everything and probably gets a little messy, or maybe you have individual model cards based on the individual submodels. It's a good point, and I think that's something we should probably put the pen to paper on. What would you recommend, or what do you think makes sense?
Yeah, I would probably say, as you rightly said, like, if we can eliminate the need for someone to have like multiple model cards with like, almost like nearly equal same set of attributes, and just having one or two attributes, that may not be the right approach. So maybe we need to have like an explicit attribute. We just say, hey, multimodal, yes or no, right? And then if it is yes, perhaps this model type potentially can expand into maybe an array instead of just a single attribute, something like that, right? I think that kind of maybe the way to go about it. And if you have, let's say, yes, you have like 2 or 3 modes, then accordingly, those 3 modes, you will have that many sets of data for some of the attributes, like training data and a few other attributes that you had explained in the next page. So essentially a new attribute to kind of explicitly say it's a multimodal or yes or no, and then depending on yes, then you have one or more sets of some of these attributes, like model type. I mean sets of values for these attributes. Is that Is that a reasonable?
Yeah, and then that kind of goes back to the initial topic of the format, right? So if you're in multi-model, maybe you have something that's more of a dynamic form and dynamic field that can adapt to multi-model data points.
Oh, right. Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot here. What I'm hearing is a strong push towards the optional side. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like there's a sensitivity to making too many things mandatory. And consistent with the discussion on format, maybe that is the path we take, saying that here are the recommended data points. Here are some suggested formats, not to be too prescriptive.
Yeah, that makes
Maybe like
sense.
the idea of things being more optional.
Can I ask, tapping through these rather quickly, are there any that jump out to folks that this one does need to be mandatory, that if you don't have at least this, you're doomed from the beginning?
I think some of the ones at the start for me, model description, I mean, it's going to be obvious you can't really have that without anything else, and possibly model type.
Mm-hmm.
Possibly license as well.
License, yeah.
So going back to my analogy of a notice file versus an SBOM, maybe things that were more notice file like, model description, model type, and license. Maybe that's sort of the table stakes to be compliant, to get out the door, and then to get a more robust card. Then you start adding in things like use cases, recommendations, bias, data sets, testing criteria.
Sorry, Brian, can you go back one page, one slide? Actually, one more. Yeah. So, sorry, one more. Okay. Yeah, this one. The develop by, not so much the funded by or shared by, but I think I'm thinking about the NIST framework, the NIST, AI risk management framework, and I don't know how that maps. Oh, actually, I think it maps to other frameworks as well. But the concept of accountability, that people want to know who trained some model for whatever purpose, right? So when there's an issue with the model, then most risk management frameworks ask that there be someone that can be contacted to address that problem. So I would vote for developed by, or at least a responsible party would be somebody, or a field that would be helpful here as required.
Right. So this will be like equivalent of a supplier or provider in case of a third-party open source component, right? Yeah, similar to that. Right. Makes sense.
I didn't see it on the slides, perhaps it was somewhere, but also like similar to the Perl or the URL, like where is this fetched from, or where is this coming from? Does that make sense?
As in an origin.
Yeah.
Question, yeah. Origin may help with jurisdictional decisions as well as just operational ones. It's on this URL, go to this GitHub repo and find it.
And that's probably my own fault, but initially with model description, I thought that was what's the purpose, what's the description of the purpose of this model, rather than describing the actual model on which it's trained. But perhaps that could use some clarification if it's other people than me making the same mistake.
And by
Jeff,
URL, are you
correct
referring
me? Sorry, go ahead.
I would say by URL, are you referring to the foundational model that maybe was perhaps modified?
No, I'm thinking more of where was this published, or what's the source for this? So if someone where did I fetch this from originally before I redistributed it to you with this data card. And that may, of course, then be the very same page you're fetching it from or the same location, but it might also have a different origin.
Just sounds like there's 2 points there, one a URL and one origin information. And that origin information, I guess, could relate to the model, the data set, where it was trained, and other areas it might open up to.
I mean, I think one thing we have to be aware of is that, you know, with software, we have a specific version number, and we know exactly which software we're referring to when we're applying various characteristics such as licensing to it. The URL itself, we need to be careful, because if the model itself is changing because ongoing work is being done in the background, we need to be able to identify the specific model, the specific version of that model that we're using. I think it's a much more dynamic scenario when we're talking about models than we are when we're talking about software. This is particularly relevant when we're looking at the compliance regime, because ongoing compliance under the EU AI Act, for example, is going to require sort of, you know, ongoing monitoring of the use of the model. And then we get into other questions which are probably outside the scope of this conversation in terms of how much information has to be fed back upstream if you're doing additional work on a model and you discover that there are some, for example, some biases with it. Is it, you know, necessary to feed that information back upstream? How do you manage that? But I say that's a broader question. I think probably one we're in a position to be able to deal with at the moment. But certainly, as Jimmy suggests, we need to be able to specifically tie the model card to a specific model and version of that model, an instance of that model that we're using.
Anything else, Brian?
Yeah, so I'm going to move us along real quick. I know we're running to our time here. So, you know, good discussion around some of these data points. I think, again, the key takeaways are most are going to be optional. Maybe we've got some more missing data points we need to add, like the multi-model. I'm sure there are some others, and perhaps that, you know, those very generic introductory data points, maybe those could be mandatory, like description, license, you know, point of contact. So next, I want to move the discussion to something we've discussed before, which is open source versus proprietary models, and this sort of dovetails into this URL discussion we just had, which is, you know, where is this from? The first question, team, is, you know, is this a distinction that's important? I know we've brought it up a couple of times, and you know, in my mind, proprietary models are unique in that, you know, the business to business license terms can sort of fill in some gaps of information sharing or risk tolerance or disclosure or indemnification. You know, there's that vehicle. On the open source side, it's open source, so what you get is what you get. And so you know, one of the questions I have here is there a greater need for open source models to have more robust framework to ensure that that information is out there, or do we think that these are just two birds of a feather, that whether it's proprietary, open source, you know, if it's in the supply chain, it's in the supply chain, it should be treated exactly the same?
Well, again, this could be considered as a bit of an optional aspect, but when it comes to open source models, obviously the expectation could be that the output generated from these models, let's say if they are using licensed training data sets, we perhaps would like to put an expectation that that output should also include or like extend those base training data set associated license text information that has to get carried forward. That way, there is a clear chain of traceability. Once we start incorporating derivative work based on those open source models, right? That could be something that we may want to put more like an expectation or more like much more so on the open source models as opposed to proprietary models. And as you rightly said, when it comes to the proprietary models, obviously many of these things can potentially be covered, or at least the indemnity for the derivative work will be covered by the license terms and conditions. However, in the open source models, if there is a derivative work being done, you definitely need that information. The output that is coming out of those open source models, it better have some level of license information carried forward if they have used a training data set that is distributed under copyleft.
You raise an interesting point here. My hesitation here is, in my opinion, the law is rather unsettled around the world as far as how copyright propagates throughout training to inference to output. So I would just caution us trying to come up with a framework that would be ahead of clear law, to the extent we even get any. Maybe the courts don't give us the answers we need.
I'm a little bit sort of troubled, I suppose, by this seems a very binary distinction between open source and proprietary. But of course, we don't really know what we mean by open source in the world of models anyway. I mean, the OSI is working very hard on thinking about this. But most of the major models that are available at the moment that are described as being open, few of them are described as being open source, aren't in any true sense to the extent that you would apply the open source definition to them. So I think we have to be pretty careful when we are trying to make this binary distinction between open source and proprietary. We're sort of leaping in with an assumption that we know what we're talking about. I'm not sure that we do at the moment. And again, I don't, I'm not helping because I'm just sort of pointing out issues that we have. I mean, given that the original OpenChain specification, it talks about open source, and the definition that it uses is very broad, deliberately and sensibly, because it's intended to ensure that all of the components that you're incorporating into a piece of software go through an appropriate procedure to ensure that they're compliant with the licenses. I mean, I'm wondering at this stage whether there's actually any real benefit in drawing this distinction between open source and proprietary. I mean, clearly, people may well be using models, and there will be some open somehow on some form of openness spectrum. Again, the mock paper and also the work that the OSI is doing is sort of pretty key to defining our terms here. But I'm just a little bit concerned that we're trying to get into the weeds before we really understand, before there is a consensus on the distinction between open source and proprietary in this context.
I think we spent about half an hour discussing this point last time, didn't we? And I think we flipped and we flopped, and I think the agreement was we may want to make that decision, but maybe we push it further down the line until a few things have played out.
Yeah,
that sounds good. Yeah, let's. Yeah, we'll just we'll move on. Yeah, I hear you. I agree. I don't know if the distinction is important in the supply chain, but just really raising this to point out the fact that a proprietary model does have that negotiated contract as a writer to sort of fill the gaps. So that's sort of a segue to my last slide here. So we've talked about model cards, and those are sort of objective data points that that can be shared. Is there a way that we can still provide trust in the supply chain without having absolute disclosure? And so here I'm looking to the OpenChain ISO. It's really about creating trust in the supply chain. It's about having internal robust processes and procedures, certifications, whether it's self-certification or third party. And really, is this the most valuable part of what we can provide to the supply chain, is to provide a set of criteria for certification, so that when a recipient gets a model from a provider, while they may not know the exact training data set, they may not know exactly how the model was trained or how it was tested, they might not have visibility into those details, but they do know that the provider is certified and that they can take comfort in the fact that that certification hypothetically includes governance of process to make sure that there are legitimate rights to the data sets, that there is testing, that there is accountability for bias, that there is a robustness of the model. The details we can talk about later, but maybe that is sort of the most important activity we can undertake, is to allow the supply chain to accept models confidently, that they know, okay, I don't know exactly what the details are, but I have confidence that this is acceptable. And I go ahead.
That's exactly the reason why I wanted to do this study group with others for exactly those points. We got a thumbs up on the.
And what I would recommend is we look to the NIST RMF, the EU AI Act, and other international documents to come up with that checklist of saying, if you have this sort of oversight, this sort of process, this sort of governance, you're a good actor. You've got a robust system that recipients can have confidence that your models are up to the appropriate standard.
Yeah, I think that definitely makes sense and add definitely value here for the ISO 5230. As part of adoption of this standard, one might want to at least get a confirmation from those organizations if you have maybe a responsible AI policy, internal policy. It's up to them how they govern that, and then they do have a process following that policy, which potentially could have, and they may also have and followed by a system to enforce those processes. So that is something that, yeah, we if this model can comprise of or gives an high level guarantee, I think that would be of great value. The organizations doesn't have to expose in terms of what the implementation or how those processes are really implemented, but it's more like, as long as just existence of that and an assurance of that process continuously being evolved and being governed should suffice, in my opinion.
Building briefly on this, in the origin of OpenChain, one of the key things in determining trust in the supply chain was the minimum that we can effectively apply to the market, reducing the key areas of risk. And in this sense, the license compliance specification was designed to give a framework for companies to get started, and then inevitably to continually improve as their customer companies required greater and greater process management, more detailed records, and so on. The standard has always split the difference between requiring process inflection points to be unequivocally existent, but the process content to be potentially private, except in cases where a customer company would require a supplier to reveal such processes' content. And of course, we expect that that type of reveal would be controlled by contracts and confidentiality. Now, when it comes to AI, as Brian pointed out, it seems that the same basic approach may bear fruit as well, in which case we have the interesting question of what's potentially the minimum we can apply here in terms of setting the tone for the market, and giving plenty of leeway to go into more detail over time to allow more requirements to unfold. But what's the minimum we can bring to the table today, given the uncertainty in things like legal determinations, regulations, and so on? And I think it makes a lot of sense to look to existing material as a baseline to build upon. Perhaps in some cases, we need not follow religiously all of the material out there. We can determine what would be useful out of each part to give us a framework upon which to build. And over time, we can increase the fidelity of the material that we encourage the market to have. But yeah, in essence, Brian, I think it's a very good approach to look at some existing materials, have a checklist approach, come into this as light as possible while meeting the key requirements in the market for reasonable quality, and then expect by sheer momentum of natural market evolution, new regulation, inter-party contracts, that fidelity and detail will increase over time. So I think this approach is genuinely good, and that might help us focus conversation even further. If we say, whatever we do, if the basic idea is something like a list of key requirements for a quality AI compliance program, whether it's going to be a guide, whether it may conceivably become a specification, perhaps we can actually get started in the near term, because we don't need to hit the bigger issues that are still being legislated, still being discussed in courts of law. We have some basic material upon which to start with.
Anything to add, Brian, before we move over to Jeff?
No, just I would just encourage folks, a call to action to think of third-party materials that we can distill and look to for guidance on what might make sense to bring up this checklist, and to find that level of not too specific, but still thorough. But that's all I have to. I'll go ahead and pass this over to Jeff. Thanks for the great discussion, everyone.
Thanks, Brian. Do you mind if you continue to drive?
Yeah, no problem.
Thanks. So we've done a lot of the heavy lifting thus far via Brian's agenda thus far. So this first topic we've largely talked about, and I don't think we need to really parse through again. But after we spent a lot of this time, it was kind of like what deliverable do we want out of this product that we're creating here. So in the topics I want to talk about, we're talking about what's the requirement for information we need regarding the data, whether this is a card, if this is SBOM-like, or the topics that we've been discussing thus far. So moving on to, I think the natural progression from the topic we just had is maybe a presentation of the information we want to see in a data set card or a data deliverable to kind of provide for this trusted process that we're looking for. So, and I think a sub point to this is we've talked about when we talk about the difficulties in dealing with what information we need out of data is the distinction between this kind of top level, high level information, but also the iterative details that are encompassed in the information around data, such as not only kind of these sub data sets or cascading data sets, but the changes that occur. I think someone brought that up in the context of models, but the versioning of models, derivatives of models that include different processing, of which can be exponential in growth on something like Hugging Face, and how to memorialize those details so that we actually have trust in the information we're seeing. So the next slide, I think, was basically an eye chart here of the fields that SPDX3 proposes in terms of data sets. And I think when we compare that to Hugging Face, which is the next slide, and these are the only two slides I have, this is a little bit more limited in the information they request, and likely doesn't include probably what we want based on our conversations thus far. I don't know if we need to go by one through all of these. Maybe in the context of the Hugging Face one we can, because it's a little bit more comprehensive. But these are the fields that they currently have. at least on GitHub for their development of this dataset card. The next one, which is the Hugging Face one, which I think largely we're talking about in the context of models, has much more information, as you could see here. A lot of duplicative kind of information. Also, that model use, the model example was looking for like funded by, I think maybe was one of them. Of course, as was discussed before, the optional here is the Hugging Face language and not my own, as maybe all our different fields are potentially optional. But coming out of that conversation here, these, I don't know if anyone sees any fields that is maybe top level is not reflected here that we would want. And then I think we can go into kind of the more difficult issue of how to reflect changes in the data, how to reflect potential like gaps in the data. So, in line with proprietary versus, let's just call it non-proprietary, and to avoid whatever the definition of open or open source is. But if someone in the value chain does not disclose something for whatever reason, how is that accounted for in this to at least signal that there was a change or a modification or data used in a step that isn't reflected in the card? So perhaps anybody have any thoughts kind of looking at this?
My first thought, Jeff, and it's been brought up in the chat about the OpenChain scope versus SPDX scope and discussion whether things are mandatory or optional. You bring up the SPDX on the previous slide, their fields. Have they got the same for data sets? Oh, okay, this is the data set one, yes, and the Hugging Face one. So we want to do a comparison, is that right?
Or more just an example of one that's perhaps a little bit more limited in scope. If I were to advocate for something, it would be between these two, it'd be the Hugging Face one. Because looking at the SPDX one, it doesn't have the fields regarding kind of the pedigree of data that I think we're all potentially going to want when we look at data sets. Whereas compared to like the Hugging Face one, it's got information on at least a field, a placeholder for sources of data, licensing, and the like. Brian, if you could move towards that next one. Fields for data collection and processing. So I don't know, perhaps as an action item coming out of this meeting, we all kind of take a look at what we want to see in terms of these data cards or model cards and think about like these fields and what's not included, or we do that here. And then when we can reapproach this and kind of create a master list. I don't know, does anybody have any kind of concerns in terms of like what they want to see? Like for example, me bringing up this kind of iterative nature and making sure along each step of the chain of the data set creation is reflected here, not just top level, but something like that we want to make sure that is represented in a field that perhaps they're not seeing here.
One thing I would love to have a discussion on here is similar to my last slide. Is there an opportunity on the data set side to do something? My crude analogy here is the DCO, the Developer Certificate of Origin for open source projects, where there's a level of attestation saying, trust me, what I'm providing is okay. I have the rights to do it. That being said, there's no actual signed agreement or evidence that's being provided. It's more of, yes, this is okay. Is there a similar framework that OpenChain could come up with for data sets where players in the supply chain could say, essentially, trust me, this data goes okay, we did our homework, but we're not going to tell you exactly what that is. And that could provide flexibility for companies to have potentially legal interpretations or contracts or or other means to get their data or self-curated data. Just an idea I want to put out there.
Thanks, Brian. I'm not sure. I know that ISO is currently working on a standard for, and I'm trying to recall, artificial intelligence and data quality for analytics and machine learning, and that's in development. And perhaps that is something to what you're talking about. I've seen certification programs specific to like open data, but regarding kind of this tension where we potentially may have gaps, I'm not quite sure on that level.
If this is a field which may be developing the solution to what Brian mentioned, then perhaps the way we can help to address the currently perceived gap is to introduce language that suggests such a solution can and should exist, but we don't determine it ourselves and we don't point at a resource. We regard it as something the market will work out over time. So just one example, if this Hugging Face data template is relatively fixed, if it's not a moving target, if this has been in play for a while, then we could refer to having a data template that may contain fields such as, and then we list the Hugging Face data fields. And then in a reference area, we simply say that the data fields in our may contain comes from Hugging Face, comes from this location. This would allow us to do something which we've previously done in our standards, which is to not overlap with other people, but introduce terminology and refer to things that exist. And you know, as long as, let's say, the Hugging Face data template is relatively static, and if we say a data set template may contain, and we use their fields, we're in perfect alignment. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. That doesn't preclude someone doing something else, having a field they must have, because we use the term may contain. And you know, by just carefully finessing language, by saying, you know, may have, this is to Brian's point, and we use a different description of it, but may have a DCO. And we add those type of items, and if there's nothing at all in the market, we can create one. If there's potentially incoming, we can reference that as an example without being totally prescriptive. And then in each market vertical, in each section of the supply chain, companies determine the specifics with their inter-party contractual relationships. So just essentially saying we can use pretty much exactly what is there or may be there, as long as we're just careful with the language we use to reference it. I think we can get there today. It doesn't preclude us filling out market gaps that don't get solved, but it could allow us to point in directions where something may be coming, and let people know that something should be done here.
I like that approach.
It's sort of thread needle.
Yeah, I like that. I think so. In effect, if we point to this and then there's some sort of obligation that there's some sort of certification compliance with that, that
Yes.
enables like the actual trust aspect, because the presence of the template itself, if I were to arbitrarily say how many data sets on Hugging Face I look at that have a dataset card or actually are substantive to any sort of useful level, it's maybe 10%. So the back end kind of compliance aspect of that, I think, is what would make it valuable, considering kind of how we're approaching it in terms of like most of these are optional. It at least makes somebody make an effort to go through these and populate them. I question, I think there's a tension on how much trust we can get out of this in terms of what we want to require, or at least acknowledge where the holes are. And that's my concern, because I don't think we can require as the approach we're taking, a lot of this is going to be optional. But how do we indicate, if we do point to something like Hugging Face, which I think a lot of people do, and I do think it's relatively static, how do we identify where the holes are at? So at least that can be a kind of a key indicator that we can use to gauge like trust when something's ingested or used.
I noticed Dave was unmuted. Did you have something to add?
I'm not sure if the conversation has passed this point. So that's why I muted again. Here's where I'm struggling with. So if we point to Hugging Face, and I think that's a fine answer because that's where everybody in the industry is really going right now as a matter of practice for a large percentage of their both data set and model use cases. And as much as I like the SPDX thinking around machine processability for efficiency purposes, I think I think that the industry hasn't quite gone there yet, and so we have this what Shane calls a market gap on that, and yet I still don't feel like we're converging towards a solution on the question that Brian provoked around is there a lightweight way to do this? And if it's, let's say, if you have a spectrum here, there's what we do with open source today, which is we never trust top level license. We always go into some level of analysis to see when there's other buried licenses in there, and then depending on the analyst, we might surface sooner or later, but the origination process to determine pedigree with open source, that discipline, I think, based on Jeff's comment, carries over substantially to what's happening in data sets. But the problem is potentially worse and harder to detect because the industry is less mature on this. It's worse, in my opinion, because any hack like me can grab that data from one place and drop it into another and just follow the same schema. But you wouldn't be able to tell if I gave it to you that this is the part that Dave dropped in and potentially even unwound the curation that that the original author of that data set or the compiler of the data set actually put in. So now all the things that might have been done by a responsible party around adjusting for bias was just unwound by Dave. And how do you actually know what Dave actually did? Because it's not really traceable. We don't have a Git version history that allows you to go back to see what Dave did. And Dave is not to be trusted, as we all know. So we have this issue around all this stuff moving around and an inability and under our current tooling to be able to get to the bottom of that. And so I don't know where to go on that answer because it's full origination, I think, is not possible. And DCO feels like it feels a little bit too lightweight to me because I don't trust the Daves out there. Okay, I don't trust the people that have easy access to these data sets, and so I'm kind of going back to where maybe where Jimmy was, and if we treat the source of these data sets, like where I most recently downloaded them from, as sort of a new fresh data set, maybe that's where we start because it's otherwise it's hard to do the origination. You don't do the origination, you just take it as a fresh data set every time, which doesn't provide us any of the efficiency gains that I think we're hoping to get. But I think this is a tough problem.
So does this indicate perhaps that quite apart from the data template per se, we have a question of determining provenance, which will be a call of companies to determine the level of provenance they're happy with, but we need to explicitly call out a decision, a clear process decision on how you're going to address provenance, which is actually a different question from what's the self-declaration of the data or what's the SBOM of the data. But provenance itself People can copy paste, people can use fragments, people can and maybe will lie. So maybe we therefore need a provenance requirement, which is complementary to, but not tied to having a data template. Because whatever template we apply, it could be inaccurate or purposefully misleading. If there's an additional requirement to determine a provenance process, then the companies and the supply chain will determine one appropriate to their needs, or at least will know that they have to. They can't just take a declaration from whatever they get, an AI bomb, and think that's it. It doesn't solve the problem, but it might help people think about the problem. And I guess we don't have a solution today, but we're aware it's there. So maybe what we can do is flag it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because our scope, I think we agreed upon, for at least on the models conversation, is let's focus on a good, responsible handling process, so that when I give you a compliance artifact, then even if it's got, let's say, a whole bunch of things that are optional, only just as small things that are the basic required stuff, but when I give it to you, then you know that my process, wasn't inherently fundamentally flawed, right?
Yeah.
So you have the germ of trust to start with.
Yes, and this would suggest that a company would do best effort for clear provenance, or declare they don't have it. This is what they've got, and you'd be able to determine if that fits into what you need, which does seem to address one of the current market requirements. And it's well within our remit. Trust in the supply chain, risk management. It's exactly on it.
Yeah, sounds good.
The great news is that we already have pre-existing language types to address it. For instance, we could talk about you may require a data template, which may require fields like, or you should require a data template, which may contain fields like this. And then you should have a process for determining provenance. And then we describe, for instance, e.g., the origin of the data, the curation of the data, et cetera, which is different from the template. But we can pretty much copy paste the approaches from our standard. Should means must, may means optional. And if we say you should determine provenance, we're not telling people how to determine the level of provenance, but they must do that. So we can basically copy paste our existing institutional knowledge into addressing this problem.
If we apply this to the use case that we talked about last time, as our first use case, which is an open source LLM, as a thing to test, any our basic process assumptions. I think we do end up in a spot where we can, not prioritize the data set piece. I think, for any large LLM, I think that on the model side, the optionality of pointing to the data sets is something that we talked about as something that most companies are not going to be able to do right now, simply because of the legal liability that would be triggered. And so that's probably going to be more of a pure open source thing, when people want to disclose that. Notwithstanding the good points made by Ibrahim and team on, the gradient of openness there. But on the data set side, that'll be handled within its own boutique industry, because for any of the large LLMs, you're going to be training on multiple data sets, and some very substantial ones, at least for the ones that are, well known. So maybe that's not a blocker for us.
I wanted to segue into the next topic here that Dave just touches on around processes and that LLM use case that we had. But just before I do, Jeff, did you have anything else you wanted to discuss, or anyone else on this specific data sets topic?
That was the end of my slides.
One point to make here. The concern for me here is, as I know everyone kind of tends to normalize using the Hugging Face template. I'm just wondering, like, how far this is also kind of being adopted, like by our, the other like mission readable standards, like primarily around SPDX, AI profile, and data profile. So the data profile that's supported by the SPDX, are they looking at this same template, or how is that getting evolved? Because down the line, like as these templates evolve, we certainly don't want, like, because there is definitely in the industry, there's been a good adoption of the SPDX so far, being there for some time, and obviously many of them who are in the 2.x spec, they will be expected to move or upgrade their platforms to 3.0 in the future. So when that happens, they are most likely for their internal processes, they might start using the corresponding profiles supported by the 3.0 for SPDX. So I'm kind of trying to understand, if there is something that we can ensure that the data templates, that the data sets that we are trying to specify, there is a correlation that can be drawn or suggested, that will help those organizations which are already using maybe a certain specific standard, like SPDX or a Cyclone DX, with the supported AI profile, can also get benefited from.
It's a very good point, Prasad, and perhaps it can be addressed in a relatively broad way. Let's say hypothetically we end up creating a guide, and this guide contains some recommendations like should or may. And in the case of dataset, it says there should be a process to obtain, create, and or archive data templates. And at that point, it's completely agnostic, but we could add, e.g., Hugging Face data template, SPDX AI profile template, and so on. So in this sense, we'd be able to create a generalized requirement for data templates, and then cite some of those out in the market, key ones, so people wouldn't feel excluded, but leave leeway for new ones to come into play, old ones to become depreciated, and so on. So I think we could probably address this with the existing approaches to language.
Yeah, okay, makes sense.
Which is a nice segue into opinions.
Matthew's still trying to segue.
Sorry. Yeah, am I okay to share my screen rather than? Is that okay?
Yeah, please do.
Jeff and Brian, thank you so much. That's been really interesting material to go through. Incredibly valuable.
Indeed. But it was the evolution of what we did last time, highlighting those fields that we might require, going down into that extra level that may be helpful, which we can come up to a higher level to think about what that sort of good looks like, and then leave it down to the individual entities to pick up certain threads there. What I wanted to touch on, we've just got some 25 minutes left or so. The last session that we had, this is the slide that I think was created. I just kind of condensed things. We touched on several different points that we wanted to look at for models in the top box, and then the bottom box was around data sets. And I think some of them may overlap, as we saw in the Hugging Face example by Brian and Jeff earlier on. A few of us sort of fleshed this out a little bit more in detail that I'd like to share with you over the next kind of 20-25 minutes. And I think one thing to say is this is just the first iteration of of what we could flesh out towards a principles or guidance document. This is in no way a set version of it. So I'm going to pick out some of the key points that we highlighted last time, which we can open up for discussion. Then I think further work that we can do between now and next month is maybe flesh them out a bit more, or add certain fields in there. I think the two presentations we've just had automatically say we probably need to update some of these points that we summarized in the last session. So if I open up this document, we can share this document afterwards unless it's already been shared.
I've just shared it via the mailing list, and also in the chat you'll find a link to it. And bear in mind, this is just taking the slides and then trying to reorder the bits in the slides and put some descriptive material there.
So this was just taking it a little further towards that guidance document. We wanted to, I guess, pick out the processes that build trust in the ecosystem, whereas, we will highlight in here, you might not give me all of the data sets, but if I trust you to, follow this process and you sign up to it, then, you don't need to give me all of this information. So there's just 2 pages. Those bullet points that you saw on the previous slide from the previous session are in here. They're in different order, just on sort of logical thinking. A couple of points to note is, as we said before, with the models and the data set, we thought some of the things overlapped. Equally, we touched on this open source LLM concept. It might be the fact that it's that as a use case, it might be models, it might be data sets, it might be both of them. It's a whole host of other AI topics that use cases we probably need to consider. So in each of these points, we kind of bold model and or a data set. Let's just put an asterisk in what the use case is for the time being. And I kind of just wanted to highlight some of the things of how we might, I guess, build that trust between the two groups. The bit in yellow at the start is taken, I guess, similar from the ISO 5230 standard, where if we're wanting to build trust, we would have in a company a policy. We're not saying what that policy states, but you should have a policy. You should have some form of training related to AI management, some mitigation plans if issues rise, and clear allocations of responsibility for the program. That was kind of taken from the last standard, as I just said. So that's sort of preamble to this more specific AI topics. The next bullet point is around creation of AI bombs, which we touched on just briefly. Again, we should have a process to require or create an AI bomb. The second point is around recording it and archiving it. So, if a company is giving me a model or data set or something else, we should have some form of AI bomb. And equally, if we're producing one, we need to record it and maybe archive it so we can give it to partners downstream. And as Shane pointed out, the language around we should have one, but what that one looks like is up to you, whether it's an industry standard like SPDX with Inface, or even another SBOM related to AI, and that can even be a proprietary one between 2 entities. But the concept of having an AI bomb, we believe, would be a good point. Any comments on that so far? Moving on, and feel free to interrupt me as we go on. I'll just kind of talk about the next large bullet point. We thought about the ownership and liability related to whatever that model or data set is, and highlighting, we should identify who created it, maintained it, trained, validated, distributed, or deploys it. And again, this comes to the points that Jeff and Brian mentioned in the Hugging Face data set, Hugging Face nomenclature. There's also things like funded and shared, and I'm sure a few others that we may want to consider in there. We highlight the word may because it might not be possible to identify all of these. And to that second point here about identifying who has oversight and responsibility, we felt that this was also an important point here. We thought about an example before of, a company may create it, another one may have trained it, and then my company may distributed. Somebody else can deploy it. So having that list of the entity we thought would be good for that trust. The definition of entity may need to be defined, because is that a company, an individual, is it a government organization? We might want to explicitly call out what we define as entity. Moving on, so I think there's just about 10 or so of these. There should be a process to identify where the model and or data set was created and or trained, and which requirements apply to the model or data set. Then moving on to the use cases, and are there any exclusions to the use cases? We used the word banned applications, I think, last time. We kind of just softened the language to highlight any exclusions that this model was designed for. Then moving on to one of our favorites around licensing and other IP-related issues to the model set. So is there a process to determine license requirements? We're not stating what they are, but have you got a good process in place? And maybe we want to flesh that out based on what 5230 can highlight. Have we looked at the open source or proprietary licensing or the type of licensing? Have we thought about IP-related rights to patent applications, trademarks, a whole host of other things we can define in IP rights? But if we are sharing these AI models or data sets, we want to build trust, we want to ensure that we have good licensing requirements or IP rights have been reviewed. Then we move down into a section which we touched on. The yellow doesn't really mean anything here. We just couldn't remove the yellow in the formatting. But it kind of highlights, I think it's got 6 or 7 different areas that we feel as though we should have a process to determine accuracy, bias, explainability, export control. And again, we highlight some examples of what that might be. So I just pick out bias for example. We have an example here where it says, we have a process to determine the potential for gender bias in development, deployment, or other factors involving the model or data set. So again, we're not highlighting you need to determine what bias is. It's just you are looking at bias, and that might be in a use case for accuracy and reliability. If I've got a large language model which is writing an email, I'm just going to check the accuracy. I don't need 20 people to review it. But if it's a large model that is a significant portion of my business, I might want to have a process in place to determine the accuracy that may have more testing or may have different types of reviews. So skip down, and we've just got the last 3 points here. So you can see some of the other points that we kind of categorized together. We talk about testing, relevant testing. As I just mentioned there, depending on the use case, we might want to do less testing, more testing, and we put it down to the individual entity to define what is relevant. When we say we should have relevant testing, these might be defined questions for a language model to test for accuracy and bias, amongst other things. But it's down to that individual as long as we have that process in place. And we have a process to determine compute resource related to training and maintaining the model data sets. And then finally, a process to identify the energy or sustainability requirements that apply to the model. So that was all of kind of fleshing out those documents from the points from last time. I will pause there to hear what people think, and then we can talk about what we might want to do to springboard and go to the next steps.
And just to reiterate, this is designed to capture the pre-existing 20 points or so that were listed in the last meeting. But just to look at them, it's not meant to be a finished document by any means. It's a series of notes trying to capture some of the spirit of what was discussed in a singular description. And obviously the last hour and a half brought up both clarifications and new material that should be added to the notes. So it's very much a scribble pad designed for further review as opposed to anything that's meant to be done.
I'm wondering at first glance, this is Jeff, if this feels like an expansion of at least how I thought the direction this was going. In that we're almost creating best practices when there's already very robust documents in terms of best practices. And then we're kind of tasked to how to distill those when perhaps we don't necessarily need to do that for this group. And I'm open to what other people seem to think. And maybe I was my kind of takeaway was incorrect, but I thought more the direction we were going through is what vehicle, what deliverable can we define that promotes the trust in the kind of movement of the data or the model through the supply chain. And here we're kind of putting it upon ourselves to aggregate regulations, distill perhaps the NIST document, the ISO, when can reference those as already robust and a very comprehensive work product. So thoughts what other people think.
Yeah, I think, Jeff, I see your point. I think that's exactly what I was feeling as well, is that we are referencing some of these other regulations and other standards that are in place. My one question is that are we within the open chain somehow providing a added value of the primary fundamental question, which is one of the key challenges that I think we all users of models face, is the data set, derivation, and the data set, the model genealogy, right? How are we helping in providing some additional characteristics or some additional regulation that we can recommend that will help towards solving that problem? Yes, we can always look at other recommended standards, but what are we, like, as part of an extension, or when we come up with a reference documentation for OpenChain adopters, what are we what we can recommend to address that problem? Or is it something that perhaps we need to rely on other framework only, right? I mean, maybe this is something that maybe at this point we are limited from specifying.
One point that's always been on my mind is, NIST EU AI Act. They're very jurisdictional specific. Here we have an opportunity to be a global principle document that we refer to each of those as and where is applicable.
I think this is looking really good, Matthew. I think this is definitely. It feels to me as though it's got the right level of abstraction, which is something that I've been concerned about. That we've been going too far into the weeds, because ultimately, first of all, it echoes very much the same level of abstraction that the other open chain standards have, which is obviously helpful. But it focuses on sort of process and governance, and I think that's what we're about. And it's very useful to have discussions about the weeds as well, because obviously this will have to be implemented in some way, and so we have to go into the detail about that. But I think the way that this is shaping up is looking very good to me. So thank you for your work on that.
Thanks, Andrew. Dave, comments?
Hey, so the breadth of some of the points here, it reminds me of so the thing that I think we've been trying to not redo is so if you look at the ISO specification 42001, that's the ISO specification on AI management systems. Okay, it's in the information technology, category for that. And they cover a number of things around the responsibility of AI, and how those should be handled. It's mostly about the way that you handle your own AI, but there's sections in there that talk about within a supplier-customer relationship. And when you look at those provisions, the part to me that's missing from that is the part that core OpenChain basically handled for open source. To Andrew's point, the process and governance piece of it is, I think, the ingredient that is missing from 42001. It covers so much of these issues. It covers all these responsible AI pieces of it, but it doesn't create enough of a framework to create a efficient supply chain. So when we talk about trust, and trust is it's a nuanced thing when we talk about OpenChain, because when we talk about OpenChain, it's about trust in when I give you the compliance artifacts, you trust that the process I used to build those artifacts is reasonably reliable. But then when we talk about AI, there's a bunch of somewhat warranted distrust in AI itself, and that trust aspect, I think there's a Venn diagram you can draw, say there's an overlap between the two. But if we stay in our lane on what made OpenChain a successful project, it's the process and governance pieces that we brought to bear, and it's in those pieces, when we talk about the licensing artifacts and those things that are closely adjacent to that as those essentially required pieces, I think that's where I think it plays to our strength, and not run into an issue of overlapping with other established ISO standards out there.
Thanks, Dave. Jimmy's raised his hand.
Sorry, I just rejoined back, so I might have missed this, so interrupt me if not appropriate or already covered. But about playing to strengths and avoiding overlap, I think sort of at least my guiding vision here is, what would I find useful if I came in blank to this space? What would I need to get started with a quality program as quickly as possible without being completely descriptive of what I should do, right? That's how I see the guiding star of OpenChain, and how I tend to think of this as well, where we can really provide value. If someone does come in as a blank slate here, they don't have any processes. How and what can we provide them that gives them a head start, right, to build their program around?
And do you think a framework like this, Jimmy, obviously built out and more reviews, is the direction that could solve that?
Sorry, I missed the last 20 minutes, but from the discussions we had and what I saw before I left, I would agree that this is definitely the right direction.
Prasad, you've got an unusual logo on your screen. Were you trying to raise your hand?
Oh, my apologies. I think I was okay. Yeah. I think I agree with Jimmy to a certain extent. I think my earlier concern was around, like, are we going to have some additional, like, as part of the initial adoption of OpenChain, how are we going to at least kind of provide some direction, minimal direction to early adopters, or the initial adopters, to provide a direction on how they can have the certain processes or governance incorporated. And that could be, again, based on references to existing frameworks and standards. But if we can be that bridge to point to the right governance, or we also specify additional criteria that needs to be incorporated, as part of the overall AI model governance that comes as an add-on for adapters. I think that would be the goal of this exercise. And I think in that aspect, I think we are moving the right direction.
Just a side note, I'm just going to very briefly share my screen on it. I think Dave made a great point about staying in our lane in terms of we know what we do well, and perhaps some items that have come up are fairly uncontroversial, like a process to deal with AI bombs, or a process to determine the licensing of the model. So perhaps this concept of find the routes where we're most useful. And out of the conversations we've had, there's a bunch of other stuff which we probably should make note of, but then go back to the core of what we're able to do, what we've done before, what we know is a value add on the governance and so on side, and run forth with that as a potential outcome or guide in the future. I mean, it seems like these conversations already have identified some things which just should exist, like the AI bombs or check your licenses. And just to add to Dave's point about our historical approach, I think OpenChain has been very good at trying to narrow down the core and then working out how to get that to market, how to describe it to people, how to potentially make a guide out of it, and so on. So I would suggest that at this juncture, we have an awful lot of pieces. We had 20 pieces from the last meeting. We've had additional pieces from this meeting. Maybe we should start getting to the point where we look at the pieces that are at our core. We try to bring those together and think about, is that enough to make a work product such as a short guide to get started? And we also put on the to-do list all the other things that may or may not be addressed by other standards and guidance. And then we take time to double check if that's a fact or not, or if it's something in the governance field we can address. But whatever we do, I do suggest that we try to see what it is that we've already got that is practical, that helps with governance. And we consider, is that enough to bring something to market to help people in the supply chain at this juncture? Have we defined enough of the problem domain to do so? Ideally, and from the conversation we've had here, it sounds like we might have enough material to begin helping people, as long as we don't accidentally overlap with other parties or produce something confusing. But I would like to try to end up with some form of work product that in the nearer rather than further future that can assist people in addressing this issue. And by cutting it down to the bone that Dave suggested, we might be able to do that. Just looking at what we've got here, what we've seen in the other presentations.
We're coming to time. We are meeting again. This is going to be our monthly meeting, the Tuesday, the 7th of May. This time is the next time we meet up. Proposals, what are people's thoughts on what we want to try and cover, either in that 2-hour session or anyone wanting to contribute between now and then?
Sorry, go ahead.
So I would propose that we take a look at the existing ISO from OpenChain for open source compliance, and just take a look at that, because people are familiar with that. It's going very well, and to see what minimal changes can we make or glean from that to do something similar for AI. There's I wouldn't say a lot, but there is some commonality here. But I think there's differences. But I think it'd be a nice framework and the skeleton to build upon.
Could I make a proposal then that interested parties in doing that, we have a working session in the intervening time between now and the 7th of May to go through that and maybe pick out how we can broaden it to AI related models, data sets and others, or equally take this document that Shane shared around the scribbled notes to see if we can merge them to make them look similar. Would anyone be interested in that proposal? One thumbs up. Two thumbs up. Stephen?
And I think a lot of this can be done async with, you know, as Brian said, maybe taking 5230 and just highlighting it via email and shared document, highlighting bits, looking at the information captured here and having something as a scratch pad there. And then, you know, if people don't have time to commit to a call, they can track what's going on with the doodles on that. And then the next workshop can be a deeper dive in and see, did we consolidate enough to think we might have a future guide, which is roughly what we did on security. It became a guide formed from the license standard. And that guide over time was expanded and developed. And by happenstance, it became a specification and a standard later.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. We can work over. I think email is probably the best for this. I don't think it's terribly complicated. And then maybe for the next meeting, we can sort of come up with a first impression of, here's the delta, here's where there's commonality, here's where we need to make a few tweaks, and here's where there's something that's completely lacking in the current standard that needs to be addressed for AI from a process perspective, from governance.
Wonderful.
Are you okay to do a kickoff call to provide the link for 5230 to this mailing?
Sure. I'll provide this and a scratch pad continuation for us.
Great. Well, look forward to hearing from you all on email over the next month. But if not, the 7th of May at this time, we will see you then.
All righty.
To close the meeting.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Meeting. Bye-bye.